Thanks very much. A hard act to follow after Shara's performance before me, and I hope that it's not the nodding off hour. You've still got an hour to keep fully awake, please. So it's just, I guess, thanks for the nice words from Graham at the start about I'll go into a bit more about my background. But in my session, I'm sort of doing an introduction to what design management is. I'm going to do a case study using one of our clients, Avida's Aria Bay Retirement Village, that we're still building the second stage, but 3 years ago we were involved in the design and the build of the first stage. And then I'll go through the sort of overall design process. And if we've got time at the end, just a bit more detail on services integration. So it's Jamie Vallance. My background is I started off as a PQS with Maltby's quite a number of years ago, again overseas as a PQS in London, and then came back and worked with MacDowell Properties or Hawkins Development for a few years before the economic crash in the mid-80s. There was acting as a project manager, and then joined Mainzeal initially as a project quantity surveyor, then ended up sort of as a project manager looking after a project up for Clenso House, and then I sort of got into, by chance, design management. We had a first sort of into Mainzeal at the time, a GMP contract to do the Maritime Museum, and I got involved in that. We weren't responsible for the design, but when you're managing, looking after the cost, I had a great interest in the design as it progressed to make sure it fitted the initial cost plan. And then I guess that over time that involved in building up a design services department, getting 8 to 10 people at its height, was mostly design and build projects that Mainzeal had on at the time. And then I started at the 2000 with Multiplex as their design manager, 4 years before seeing the light and setting up with Shane Brearley, NZ Strong, actually 18 years ago. The other day was when we started in that. And at NZ Strong we've done a number of design and build projects, but in the initial stages, but more recently ECI type projects. That's, I guess, the design services team we had at Mainzeal, and there's a few Mainzeal people in the room, so they probably recognise a few of those faces, but it was quite a big thing, number of design build projects that we had. So what is design management? Design management involves the planning, leading, organising and controlling and problem solving activities, and Shara sort of covered some of that as well in hers. Design management is critical to the successful delivery of the project, whether it's a build only or design and build or an ECI. Design management to me is critical. To have a successful set of documents at the end of the design phase is that you've got to manage the process. Ineffective management will impact on time, and cost and quality. The process, I guess, ensures that the design issues are resolved prior to the construction phase. The old acronym is it's easier to erase a line from a plan than it is to rectify it on site with a jackhammer. And it allows a smooth transition from the design to a construction, and either, as I said, a build only or a design build or ECI. So what is a design manager? This is a little chart that I found on Google that I did encompass all the areas that a good design manager has got to have a good sense of cost, time. He's got to have a good understanding of the original cost plan, may have been involved in the cost plan preparation, quality assurance, information and document control management systems. It's got to have a very good, understanding of the New Zealand Building Code and relevant standards. And that's all gained by experience. That's not by studying at university or whatever. That's knowledge learnt on the way through. Administration activities. And then on the other side, you've got that education and knowledge. So there's quality and value. Oops. I've gone backwards. Understanding of coordination, and then on the leadership, again, as Sarah's went over, is it's motivating others, it's communicating and understanding, cooperation and delegation, flexibility. I mean, we'll get into that with a design program. There will always have to be flexibility. Consultants will have issues that will mean that you have to rejig the logic on the program, but if you're made aware of it early enough, those things can usually be accommodated. It's giving that sense of responsibility to the team. So that's, I guess, is the three sort of attributes as I think is a good design management. But again, as I say, it's all gained by experience. Again, it's a similar graph to Shara's, but just to the old iceberg, that the ability to change the design is within that design phase. That's the majority of the iceberg is below the water, and in the construction phase, which is above the water, you've got minimal ability to change it, but the impact of getting the design wrong on the construction phase can be major. Now the case study, Jonathan Ash, General Manager of Development for Avida Group, got us involved in this retirement village at Browns Bay, Aria Bay. He brought us in not as an ECI contractor that was involved in just buildability, but he said, we want you to manage the design. So it was at the concept design, or they just got resource consent. He said, we want you to actually manage the design consultants and produce at the end of the day a set of consented documents and lead into a construction contract. And Jonathan said at the only time that he thought that the contractor had the best ability, because he saw no job, if you didn't get it right, you had no job to build at the end of the design phase if it was over the construction budget. The designer consenting with design program gave certainty on a construction start, so that if you're going to start in March next year, you knew with certainty you could start then, rather than it may be a few months later, and when you're organising your resources and all the rest of it, that was a key one. And a good set of design documents makes the construction phase a lot easier, and I can't reinforce how that makes the things. And not to say that we haven't had a few issues on ARIA, but if there's only 1 or 2% that you haven't got right, that's still a long way better than getting an uncoordinated set. This is just an extract out of the pre-construction contract that we had. But the preferred contract will manage the design team at the direction of ARIA Bay's representative in respect of the preparation and completion of the design deliverables in accordance with the ECI model adopted by ARIA Bay. And the preferred contractor will ensure that the design deliverables are carried out in accordance with the program set out in Schedule 4, which is the design program we had. It had to meet ARIA Bay's budget for the project. It had to be fit for purpose and meet the client's brief. And it also meant that we had to identify and assist in resolving all buildability issues. And the key one there was the preferred contractor will review the design as it developed to assess its completeness and be party to that coordination. The village at Aria Bay, 2 stages. The first stage was a care building for 57 care suites, and then the second one that we're building at the moment is a common space and 57 residential apartments. it also included a link building into the existing retirement village.
So Jamie, at that stage you weren't signed up as contractor, it wasn't a design build contract, it was just
it had a building contract appendix to the pre-construction agreement, but the criteria was we had to get to their construction budget as a fixed price lump sum at the end of it.
There was no design risk, so to speak, aside from not...
We were responsible for the design, but I guess we had a condition of pre-construction that we weren't responsible for the consultants' negligence or omissions and that sort of thing. So the consultants' faults were being a designer, we weren't taking that role on.
So was the budget displayed at the start, or were we sort of flying by line and doing what you thought was right? Was the budget provided at the start, i.e. a figure that you did for it? Or was that kept under wraps?
We had to tease it out of them because all too often clients are very, they just don't want to release that true budget. But we say to them it's in everyone's advantage for that to be cleared early on, because at the end of the day, there's no point in getting to a thing if they've got, if we said it's 40 million project and they've let us go all the way through and said, at the end of the day, we only had 36, then that's wasted a lot of people's time and all that. So.
Was there any guarantee that you were going to get the construction job afterwards?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, if we met the construction budget or the lump sum figure, then we would roll in. It had its normal things. If the market had dropped out, and there was no Vida's feasibility wasn't going to stack up and all that, they had the right to terminate it. But as long as we hit the dollar value and we did a good set of, they were happy with the design management process or that we hadn't breached our pre-construction agreement, then yes, it went into a construction contract.
Was there a set fee for the design management service, or it was just an engagement to say if you get the job?
No, it was a set fee. We gave them a fee to do the design management or do that pre-construction agreement.
How did you deal with contingencies? Did you have a contingency, design development contingency? Was that kept contractor side, or was it transferred over to Arvida? So we've done something similar on a smaller scale for Arvida. They took the contingency back in-house and took all the design risk on after the end of it was a very weird arrangement.
No, this is pretty simple. I mean, the consultants were paid directly by Avida and managed it through. And I guess if there came up a variation in the construction phase that was a design omission or something, then it was paid as a variation. So
yeah,
okay. How do you set the balance with your potential lost opportunity cost if you don't get the main contractor role at the end versus not overcharging for the design management?
The ECI fee we put on was a reasonable fee to do the job for Avida. I guess what happens in it was a negotiated job, so it was up front in terms of what our actual costs were, and they did actually pay us for our true cost. You will find, and as you all know, in ECI contracts that are tendered, that the ECI fee may be a third of what it actually costs. But what we find, well, my personal thing is, if a contractor puts in an ECI fee of $50,000, but in reality it costs, it's $200,000 worth of cost. In the ECI contract, you're only going to get $50,000 worth of work out of the ECI contractor, so it sort of defaults the benefit of it, in my opinion.
What was the main contract set up? Was it an open book or something like that? So I just wonder, when you've got the design manager...
It was open book in terms of tendering the trade. So when we got to the completion of the detailed design, then we open booked, went to all the, the rule book was, 3 or 4 tenderers or subcontractors per trade, and it was all open book in terms of putting together. We did a sort of detailed worksheet of each trade and our analysis on that, and that was reviewed by their PQSs before the contract was signed. This is the project here. It's on the corner of Brownsbow Road and Woodcotts Road. The one on the right is the first stage that we're completing, and we're now building that, where the low-level one has now been demolished, and we're building the second stage, which is the apartments. Okay, so I'll just go through the next one is the design inputs. So I guess the design input was establishing the principles, project requirements. In the case of Aria Bay, that was, they had got a resource consent, so the resource consent set of documents was a key one, but also what Avida had, and it's similar, I guess, to some of the other retirement villages, is they have fairly standard details that they've developed over time, and that was also given to us and the consultant teams as the part of the brief. So when I say that, the care room has to be a certain size, or these are the configurations of the bathroom, and the type of mechanical system they're using or hydraulic systems, those were sort of prescribed. Obviously setting out the design manager's role. Yeah, we'll come on to that. Yes, we were. So, all the RFPs to the consultants, we were involved in commenting on the scope of the works and so forth. And when the bids came in, sort of commentary whether, when they were analysing the consultant they were going with, we had an input into that. Time. Controlled by a design program, which we'll come to shortly. The key thing of any program is to review it, and we reviewed it weekly to ensure how we were tracking. Cost, we managed the cost of the consultant services. When I say that, Avida paid the consultants, but with the consultants' progress claims, we were asked to comment whether we thought they were at a certain percentage, and if there were any variations in the design fees, whether it was reasonable or not. Monitor the cost of the design development and stay in line with the cost plan. What we did at preliminary design, as I say, that they had got resource consent, so there was a little period just to complete the preliminary design process, and then we did a very detailed cost plan, and that became the project budget. Quality, again, assurance of the quality of the drawing specifications and the schedule of finishes, that we met the client's brief, and obviously the statutory requirements. We were involved, as I said, with the consultant selection, appointment and evaluation, assisting in the drafting of the RFP for the consultants, and the RFP, I guess what we see is in any RFP going is that you need to give what the design phase deliverables, which is, we've talked about the CI, well, Shara's mentioned about the CIC guidelines. We'll go into a bit more detail of it. They've got, this is an industry CIC that was developed 15 or so years ago because they could see that there was major issues in the construction area regarding quality of design. So they got together lead consultants and contractors and came up with a sort of guidelines that set the phasing in terms of concept, preliminary, developed and detailed design and construction phase, and then they set down in each one of those sort of criteria of what you would expect to get in each of those phases. We've over time have developed that into more detailed prescriptive, so for the architect or the fire engineer or the structural engineer, civil engineer or whatever, very prescriptive for each of their phases what is required, and I'll show you a bit more of that. But that rule book needs to go in the RFP, what we are expecting the consultants to deliver. There's a design program. In this case, we had the Avida design manual, the resource consent conditions and plans, and the BIM execution plan. And we had sort of a template of a consultant PQP that expected the consultants to follow once they were engaged. We assisted in that review of the consultants' RFPs and the engagement of those selected consultants. As I said, the Avida design brief and room data sheets, these set the minimum requirements for all the consultants, and they obviously, for Avida, are sort of standardised for their company nationwide, and it assisted us with the effective management of that design, and it picked up from lessons learnt from their previous projects, and the lessons that we learnt on Aria Bay, they're now using on their future ones. This is the, I guess this booklet I got here is the design phase consultant and deliverables. Let's get that's fine. Maybe just go to phase 2 preliminary design. Yeah, I won't go into detail because I assume most of you know that the CIC, they have a nice description for each of the phases, but for preliminary design, just a bit, involves the further refinement of the preferred concept to facilitate testing against inputs from the team, including cost sets and regulatory approval. It may provide sufficient information for the communication of the design to a third party for marketing or consultation purposes. And during this phase, the project concepts are developed into firm schemes where the relationship and size of spaces and facilities are defined and coordinated between the design disciplines. So to me, the preliminary design is the key backbone to the project. You get the preliminary design phase right, then the consultants have a fair shot at developed and detailed design. So I tend to, in my design programs, will give more time for the preliminary design to get that building blocks right, and take a little bit out of detailed developed design, because this is the key. So for each of the design disciplines, we've set out in bullet points exactly what we're expecting of the consultants. This is in an Excel format that we do, and later on we'll come into it how we use that in the design reviews of testing the documents at a design review milestone are complete. I guess that's been developed with lessons learnt. So if we found an issue with a consultant that something's been missed out, or later on, then it gets put into our chart. And I know with our client Avida, they've sort of developing this beyond this one, and we also, with MetLife Care, have also assisted them in developing a similar one for their projects. But the key to it is it means that no one has a misunderstanding, and that's why in the rule book at the start with consultants, they're aware of what they got to do, and there's no disputes over roles and responsibilities on the way through, and that sometimes ends up being the issues we have with coordination not being done because someone says, oh, that's not my job to do that, or whatever.
Is this something you'll be able to make available to us? Mm-hmm. Is this something you'll be able to make available to us?
No, it's a bit of IP, on this one. So.
Jamie, do you guys tie that back to programs as well? Like instead of like some programs that guys will just have a prelim and they put like duration and the detail and so on. As you go through that, there's almost a sense of sequencing in that spreadsheet from what I can see.
Yeah, I'll come to the program. I will go through that in more detail, but I also don't want to take Dan's thunder because he will go through how they break it up for their projects into more very specific, so like weekly programs of what the deliverables are. Okay, I guess the design is made up, it's a multifaceted, you've got the, architect, you've got structural engineer, you've got the building services engineers, and that could be, 4 of with a mechanical, plumbing, electrical, lifts, or that. You've got your fire engineer, You've got your acoustic engineer, your geotech, environmental engineer. You possibly could have on some projects where you bring in a services design and build subcontractor. And the other area now that in the past a lot of specialist consultants were put in specifications as being the contractor to be responsible. That fortunately now the councils have assisted us as a contractor to say no, bring all that forward, so that all the specialist consultants with seismic or passive are brought on as a general consultant and not left to the later stages. I guess this is just a concept there of, you know, the team dynamics or the contradictory dynamics in a consultant team. You got the sort of architect that, you know, may have the Taj Mahal, what they're looking at. You got the structural engineer that's designing sort of a cantilevered structure off the edge of the building. You got the quantity surveyor, and those who could remember what the modal house was, that's the modal house. And you got the services team designing your next space station. It makes for fun, to be honest, yeah. And I've been fortunate to be in the industry and specialising as the design manager for the period I have, because it's enjoyable. When you're working with a good team of consultants, it's a lot more fun than working in the traditional build construct world, which always tends to be adversarial. But when you're party of the design team, whether you're managing or just party to being involved in the design, it's just a lot more pleasant way to be. This is, I guess, these tools are used, listed design consultants. Probably, you know, it's not something new, but it's just key to having, you know, a list of all your key people. The design program is going to be key to the design one, and I'll go through that in a bit more detail shortly. Yeah, you probably can't read this, but this is, I guess, a design program that we've developed, and Stephen, you probably recognise this as Aria Park because it's just a more detailed. But a design program will cover the, I guess, the resource consent process. If it hasn't got a resource consent, in Aria Bay we did have that, so we didn't have to worry about that. But in this particular project, they are going through the resource consent. It sets out the design stages in terms of your preliminary design, your developed design and detailed design. In this one, those developed design and detailed design were a relatively long periods, so we've actually put a 50% developed design milestone in and a detailed design milestone.
How do you program for risk outside of your control, Jamie, in terms of building consents and resource consents? Do you just pick a nominal time and agree that with your client?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So then we, guess, in terms of just one thing, just in terms of programming. One thing I find that consultants struggle with. If you ask them, you know, an architect, how long is it going to be for that developed design phase? They come back to me and say, I can do that in 10 weeks. That program will probably go up with 20 weeks. Because I've built a database of programs that know and realistic how long a program will be, and that's no disrespect, but it's just a reality. They just don't have a concept of you know, time that we do. So these will usually have a longer period than the consultants nominate. Yeah.
Something that's part from that as well is like when you looked at that coordination exercise we did, it's how much time you actually need to talk to each other and figure things out, as opposed to just sitting down and drawing something. You know, if you were to just sit down with all the information you needed and draw it, you probably could knock it out in 2 weeks. But you actually need to go back to the client all the time, you need to like check in with each other and then revisit something, and then all that fat you can't actually measure, but it takes time.
Right, it seems as well, you ask the same question to the consultants, right? And the service guys would say, well, I've got to wait for the architect to be done so that I get the latest background so I can start updating with the new positions. And you know, they might get 3 weeks' work, but it takes the 10 weeks of your work to get to there in 3 weeks.
Yeah. So that overview that the design manager has is critical to that, right?
Yeah, And mostly on the design programs that we have leading up to a design milestone, I had a, called NALTAC, which is New Architectural Layouts to all consultants. So maybe a week before that design milestone, so that everyone ended up with the same backdrop of documents to solve that. But that's always the argument you get. But as the working in the virtual world with BIM and all the rest of it, that argument wears thin these days. I guess the design one is your consenting strategy. On the Aria Bay project, we'd got demolition in a couple of stages, and it had a big retaining wall on the first stage, so we put a foundation and retaining wall consent. Then we did a superstructure consent. That was probably primarily that to avoid the risk that an architectural issue would hold up the structural consent, so we just took that off the program and then put a architectural and building services issue. Fortunately, when we did our program on design, it did take a while for the consenting process, and I'll go through that a bit more, because had just 3 years ago was when Grenfell Tower had reared its head, and the issues that came with regards to that when council and processing of facade consents and fire engineering, it was quite problematic for a period.
Do you find that staging the consents adds risk to cost of program? Because we were looking at doing that on a project, and the contractor said, yes, great, that's what everyone's doing. However, you get your consent for your foundations, you start building them, you're still designing the rest of the building, all the costs go up and you're too late to pull out. And the project's not viable all of a sudden, but you've already...
I guess that's discussions with your client on what risk profile they want to take. And this one here, there was, they had a timeline they wanted to be on stream, so they were prepared to get going. But, that's why, again, decoupling the structure from the architect. It's normally in the architectural and fire service and the building services, we have the duration. With a structural, where you've got a peer review, PS2, then it usually, it doesn't take as long.
How do you deal with service changes? So if you submit your structure and you've got service penetration changes and things like that happening, how would you just change that on site as a minor variation, or deal with it on site changes? Because that happens often where we said earlier bulk rigs come to play. So
the design, minor variations and all that, Jennifer's going to cover in more detail on that. But that's something you've got to consider. The primary structure, normally if there's architectural structural steel or changes to design, then perhaps you tuck it in with the architectural consent if you need to.
Did you run a dual program? Like when the architect said they needed 10 weeks, did you show a program with 10 weeks, or did you? No,
it was the same program.
So you had to build that buffer in to protect your program?
Yeah. And I can, on this project, we met all our design deliverable time frames. So we had no slippage on design. The only issue we had was on the architectural consent, where that took longer, but it didn't prevent us building in the time we got the architectural consent. We still probably had a month or so up our sleeve before we needed it, and where the construction phase was. So this one is projects that have engineering approvals, whether it's for stormwater or sewer or water supply. Aria Bay, we had a major sort of stormwater diversion system in place that had to be engineered, but it's just early in the program of getting those in the process as early as possible. And we also had infrastructure ones where we had Vector with a transformer that had to be relocated and overhead lines that had to be lowered. The design program also picks up where there's design review milestones. So we are having these ones that at the end of each of the milestones there's a week with the intent that all consultants and the clients and ourselves set aside a week to thoroughly review the documents, and I'll come through how that's recorded. Hmm?
Did that time ever get squeezed? Because I've found when we've done our own designs, is that review time is the thing that gets lost at times? Or were you very rigid on we need an exact week to review this?
Yeah, I guess, yeah. With reason, 5 or 10 working days is what we will find. The difficulty is just getting consultants to understand how important it is to sit down and give themselves time to review each other's set of documents.
Review period is no design management, basically.
Yeah, but you'll see what tool we've got there is, if a consultant comes back and says, I've completed a review and he's got no comments to raise, then you know he hasn't done a review. Sorry, the other one in there is obviously where we've got cost plans and then a fixed price lump sum in there. So we had a preliminary design budget, and then at the end of developed design we also had a period to update the cost plan.
What was the total duration of this program?
This program,
If it's, yeah, we just
it
can't
was
say
probably
back, yeah.
10 months.
10 months.
Yeah.
And that was for that specific project you showed prior to this, that's the same.
And
Yeah.
what did you allow for consent processing, and did you actually achieve it?
No, the consent processes, the architectural took, quite a bit longer than we normally would have, sort of, 40 days, working days. But on that one we had an issue, which I'll sort of go through a bit later.
So Jamie, sorry, that was 10 months from the start of design kickoff to submission of building consent, or including the processing time?
No, that excluded. That was just design.
Just
Yeah.
design.
What was that? What was the construction program? Was it so it was 10 months design? How long?
Sorry, 15-month construction. Yeah. Okay, we'll just go through the design process now. The design evolution, the design tasks and tools I'll go through. So the 2 important design tasks are the design reviews and services integration. So I'll just set out here, this is, I guess, the design evolution. If you can see the different colours, we've got yellow architecture, green is structure and the building services. And and then you've got your preliminary design, developed and detailed design phases. And you can see that sort of architecture is sort of traditionally, ahead of everyone else, as we just mentioned. And you've got the structure sort of, following behind, and then the services are sort of the one least to get going and then have to catch up by the time you get to detailed design. This is the CIC design guidance. Last one is 2016, and at the moment I think NZIB sort of working, because this is being reviewed and updated at the moment. So this is the typical CIC guidelines. This is a developed design, which is just a series of little, some bullet points and a whole lot of sort of little dots and all the rest of it. So it's not that clear what their roles are, and that's why we've developed into specific actions and bullet points, so it avoids any confusion. So this is, I guess, our preliminary design one. So this is showing the structural engineer's role, and so you can see all the bullet points that we've set out there that we're expecting. And at developed design, this is what it would look like for the hydraulic services or mechanical services. The design task that you've got to manage all the way through is the key one is the design reviews, having them as a set time that you actually do sit down and recording those design reviews. You've got your resource and building consent applications. You've got your peer review of services integrations. You've got product testing, develop the outline specification, and the key one also is liaising with suppliers for key aspects of design. We had to do quite a bit on ARIA with the fire issues with James Harding on the cladding, and obviously Elton from Samson's here as well. There's a lot of jobs we'll bring in specialist subcontractors like Elton to assist in detailing of membranes or a tanking with the ALCO or something like that. Design tools. We've got our design meetings where we have fortnightly design meetings, and I'll show you how we sort of keep those on a even keel and tracking. You've got projects whether you use Akinix or Procore, design protocols, the project consultant, project quality plans. You got your design checklists, ones that Shara sort of mentioned. You got your standard details, and you've got bringing in value management at when it's appropriate. So you've probably all been to design meetings where everyone turns up to a design meeting and you've got the agenda from the previous design meeting, which has probably grown to 10 pages long because people haven't actioned the things on the design meeting. I've always frustrated me that. So what I say is there might be a brief agenda with things that I want out of the design meeting, but I get the consultants to do a design report. So they bring to that meeting the activities that they've done in the last fortnight, the design areas that they're planning for the next fortnight. But the key one is, what information do they want out of other consultants at that design meeting that's key to them to keep going? And it also just gives a document register of what documents they've issued in that fortnightly period. And these do two things. They make them do their homework and think what they require before they come to the meeting. It makes an easier recording of the minutes of the meeting, because you just actually have to gather again all the design consultants' reports. So it's just a no-brainer, but it makes life a lot easier. I'll just touch about on value management, because the sort of context that value management is all about just cutting costs, but true value management on the way through is actually just retesting the assumptions or the givens. The examples I can give you there is a couple that on the main Zeal projects where we had a project which we had laboratories that were down at level 1, and we had the faculty staff at the top of the building, and they were having all sorts of design issues with getting the fume extract and through, and it came after a sort of meeting of what is the number one criteria, and it's a laboratory, and the fume cupboards have to work properly, so they relocated the whole laboratories up to the top floor and moved down the faculties to the lower ones. City Life Apartments, they were going to go through a real severe cost-cutting exercise, but it ended up that we found out that we were short of one lift to actually provide the effective management of the project. But I guess the value management exercise is value for money for the project, appropriate quality, an opportunity for the client operator to formally participate in the design process, client insight to the project, and improve the communication between all parties in terms of what are the givens and assumptions. Yeah. Just get a design process review. So this is undertaken at the end of each design thing. It's getting all stakeholders involved. And at each design review, the consultants verify that the documents meet the project brief. There's any cost implications that we're aware of, and incorporating, if the developed design review, then have the preliminary design review comments been included in the current set of documents.
When you say all stakeholders, Jamie, do you expect the client to do a design review as well? Do you expect the client to be part of that?
Very much so, yes, and their stakeholders. So, if it's like a Vita, it might be, the people that were dealing with the project management, but they're bringing in their stakeholders that are the end users of the building, and it might be their marketing team as well.
Sorry, when you put in the design freeze, is that a 2-week period where you stop down tools drawing, design reviews, and then provide commentary, or do you allow the design team to continue on pushing it to the next stage because you're sort of going to do a bit of work? How do you manage that?
Design, I wouldn't, it's not stopping, but I guess, the people that are catting up or something will continue through, but I would expect the principals that, of each design discipline to actually set aside a time to actually sit down and review the documents. And the basis of this one's the preliminary design report that we had. So that set up, you know, at the end of the day, when we finished the design review, we got all the documents together, and that became the booklet, including recording what the documents that had been reviewed, as a booklet that was used in the develop design phase as a checklist to go through. We also, when we finished that design review, was also to go through any comments. You know, if we might, you know, the consultants an opportunity to respond to some of the comments. The stage consents we've just talked about, but I guess what we're finding now is that there's a lot of consultant PS1s required. You got the structure, this area. Bay, we had a geotechnical thing, we had passive fire, building services, a fire report, and then we also had, you know, to duplicate that, PS2 consultants for the facade, building services, geotechnical, lifts. Sometimes you might have to get Vertrans involved. In our case, we had Schindler who have code mark that avoid that. There you get your structure and your fire report. On the bottom right, the other one that we found was that is bringing in key design. So in some instances we had to do little mini tenders, like on the case of the balustrades, windows, roof safety system, and the lifts, so that we could actually bring in that subcontractor to do the PS1 to incorporate that into the building consent documents. Because you know, council now say they won't, you know, there's no promissory notes. It's either in the consent documents you're issuing or it's not. And if it's not, they won't process it.
Can I ask a question about the PS2s? How did you identify, who identified the requirements for all those PS2s? Because obviously some of them, on some projects you need all of those, some projects you need some of those. Was that identified by the consultants, or did you go and see council at like a pre-app to say what you're going to want?
No, we identified all the ones that we needed with the consultants at the initial stages. So when we did the consultant engagements, the PS2 consultants were engaged at the same time.
Profile, or is the size of the project, or? Because obviously the danger is you know you're going to.
I think you'll find now any building over sort of, you know, 15 metres in height, you will need a facade, building services. I mean,
so it's generated by the risk profile of the building.
To answer the question, you go to a pre-application meeting and you ask the council.
Yeah, and council will say if you want the consent to process fast, you're better to organise your own PS2s. If they've got to go and get a building services, someone to review the thing, that's just going to take time, and you don't know what you're going to end up paying for it. But you know, Avida also took the review of PS2, has the benefit of not only doing it as a peer review to do the PS2, but was an opportunity for another consultant to just, you know, raise any, you know, comments, or, you know, if they thought there was some cost savings to be had or whatever like that. It validated that the you know, PS1 author of the building services was on the right track as well. So there's a bit of an insurance there as well. The other one is a key document that the fire engineers, and that's not only the PS1 fire engineer but the PS2 fire engineer, where they will want the PN222 signed off, and we'll come to an example of that with, you know, PN2, a standard document which we've converted to sort of a Word document, which we, for each project, set out the responsibility for the consultants. So this is where our building service engineer will say that we've complied with more or less the fire report by this action, and then the fire engineer normally attaches those in appendix to his PS1, and same with the PS2 author. The other one we'll come to in a minute is we also found on ARIA, because the issue of the Grenfell is that the council put the onus back on the consultants to show how the facade complied with the building code. So we had to do a facade compliance report, and I'll show you an example of that. Key one is your pre-application meetings, you know, seeing if you can get a nominated council representative to look after your project all the way through. We were lucky that we on Aria Bay that we were able to get a a dedicated supervisor. And your engineering approvals talked about. We tracked the building consent, as I say, on Aria Bay. We had a number of various consents, so we always had what the consent strategy we had when we were planning to lodge them, consent numbers, consent issue dates, and sort of a commentary. That would be updated for the design meetings to see if they're progressing. The other thing we found on that one, I don't know whether we're picking on us or not, but it's the council's, all your PS2 1 authors and PS2 authors have to be registered with Auckland Council, and we had to show them that all our consultants, that they're were valid, that they hadn't expired. We did find a couple that our consultants, their validity on their application had expired. They also assessed that some of the PI limits that a consultant might have for the particular design risk of the project you were looking after was ineffective, and they would want that reviewed. So we kept a track of that leading up to the consents. And I guess after your consultant engagements is probably getting them to fill that in so that you can make sure that by the time you get to consent, you don't have a PS1 or PS2 author that's out of date or invalid. And that applies also with the your specialist subcontractors or manufacturers. This is the PN2 22 document, which we sort of track and set out who's responsible for it. So the occupant load assessment, that's fire engineer or designer's responsible, which is in our case WSP, but it quite clearly identifies for the fire engineer who's looking after what. This is the facade compliance report, which we had to identify for the cladding system. So the architect had to go through each of the specification, identify the specification, the approvals, and how you're dealing with B1, B2, etc. So it was just a very documented process, which I think is actually quite a good one for the consultants to do.
Jamie, through that process, do you have to also evidence how you're going to maintain that facade? So building management plan, etc., maintenance provisions, or is it just as simple as providing the means of maintenance?
Yeah, no, we didn't have any specific on this one, but it just...
You need to assess access for maintenance in terms of the durability requirement?
Yeah, the council sometimes ask you for a maintenance plan, so demonstrate how you're going to be able to maintain this. It's fairly rare, but depends how detailed they want to get.
Is there a safety design review?
Yeah.
Just mindful of time, so I just think, and the other tools is the Aconex, which we're using on a number of our projects. There's obviously Procore out there, or there's a good set of emails as long as you keep a tracking system on those. Yeah, the email philosophy, you've got to be, very careful. It's all right, sort of, day-to-day sort of discussions, but if you're really recording a decision or whatever, I encourage all consultants that really should be, documented so that you can track those if we ever have to come back to it. So that's the Aconex tool that is uploading to a project website. The beauty of having a sort of Oracle or Procore system is that it's you can share that system with the other members of the design team, site team, and subcontractors.
During the design phase, do you guys make use of Procore to issue documents? So when you get to develop stage, the consultants all upload the documents into Procore for develop, detail and so on. Is that their way of transferring information to the? Yeah,
I know of Procore. I haven't used Procore, so the one we're most familiar with is the Aconex. Yeah. So I believe, yeah. We also have our own internal one, CAT plan, that we use as well to do document control for the design. This just is, Shara mentioned, design changes occur, and it's just how you manage those on the way through, but they can be external ones, client, unforeseen circumstances, changes in statutory requirements, or products obsolete or unavailable. And that one seems to be a growing trend at the moment, I guess, with the worldwide issue after COVID and all that. They seem to find a lot of products that are being withdrawn from the local market. They can be internal design or site team. And I guess when you do it is to determine the effect on the project brief, time and cost and quality. But the key one is to get it sorted out in the preliminary design and avoid any design changes, particularly at detailed design, because that's just adds a whole lot of time and frustration to the project. That's our program. This one, you probably can see from the diagrams, but it's just a sort of a picture thing I had at each of the services of how you other big ones of integrating into the design, whether it's air conditioning, lighting, fire pump rooms, modern bathroom in terms of aesthetics and placement, the size of a toilet or a wash hand, a basin, all that, all has an impact in terms of where the floor waste goes or vents. I'll stop it here because this is something you can read or share, but I'd sooner like to get your questions before we wind up.
Having been in the design management industry for quite a while, James, what innovation would you like to see brought to the industry in terms of the New Zealand construction industry? What do you think is lacking in the way we do things currently?
I guess the key thing is getting a good set of, getting a good consultant mix, and getting a good consultant mix can mean that clients need to be careful that when they're selecting the consultants, it's not necessarily about the best, lowest price. Because you can have a structural engineer that might give you a fee of $2 million and you get another one that's giving you $1 million. But if the project costs you 40 mil of structure for the 2 million, but the 1 million costs you 80 mil of structure, then where's the benefit in that? So you've got to be careful that if you pay, if the consultants are paid a reasonable fee, then you'll get a good service out of them. But I've seen too often where consultants have gone in too low. They're worse than contractors, consultants, or the things in terms of monitoring their costs. So if they say we've only got 100 hours on that to do design, and they've come to the end of developed design, they've spent 100 hours, I find for the detailed design, I get you can get a lot of issues there. That's one of the key ones, is getting the right consultant time. You've got to give them the time. It's no good driving a consultant, as Shara mentioned, to a steep vertical cliff face to develop this. Don't work. It's a logical process and it is time consuming, but you've got to let it flow horizontally, not as a vertical side.
I note your comment about prelim design being quite important to the process. Would you say a more agile approach to prelim design would be more valuable than your conventional design approach? So more sprint design planning?
It's getting your basic building blocks correct at preliminary design so that you have thought about all your incoming services, the footprint of the building, and all that as the basic, so that when a structural engineer starts designing it, he can go with certainty that columns aren't going to, they're going to move 50 millimetres, but they're not going to move a metre, that sort of thing. So you want to get those basic building blocks of what it's going to be, your facade, what's that going to be, and how that affects the structure and all that, all those basic things sorted out before you go too far on it.
The other time-consuming component of front-end design phases is around stakeholder consultation. You can't cut back on that time, even though you're not producing necessarily, it takes time. So education projects, for example, are massive in terms of the stakeholder groups, but even with our bidding, they've got the different departments within the business that need to be consulted. And if you can get that wrapped up during concept as in PD, it means that it leaves the design team to focus on delivery from development design onwards.
I mean, that's important because, you know, when we've done at NZ Strong a couple of, you know, brand new schools on a, you know, a design and build basis, you know, that upfront thing is, as you say, is involving the, you know, the school committee in terms of what they're, you know, briefing and all the rest of it. So it does take a little time up step on that type of thing. You know, I mean, I guess an apartment building and retirement, we might understand where it is probably faster, but you know, a specialist building in a healthcare or whatever like that will take a longer period.
Question, Jamie, on you know, it's all great if all the consultants play ball and you know, you get that harmony and everything else. When one of them or a couple of them are dragging the chain, who you don't have a contract with them, you don't have teeth. How do you manage that, or do you have to relay that back to the client and get them to bring?
Yeah, I mean, we had a couple of consultants on RAB that, you know, did have a few issues back, but I mean, you know, I had a fairly close relationship with a VEDA team, so if there was a consultant that wasn't playing ball, then, you know, we'd just go back to a VEDA and then we'd jointly put a bit more pressure on them and that, yeah. But normally, you know, we got round it.
I think it's about identifying it early and then coming up with a plan. It might be if they're short on resource, or there might be something else going on that they haven't actually shared that's meaning they're dragging the chain. If you can talk them through it and get a plan together.
The thing that you know, I say to consultants, if you give me enough warning at time that you've got an issue and you can't make a deliverable, let us know. I can reprogram that. But if you tell me I've got a design drop and the day before you tell me I can't make it, you're going to be a week late, then that's you know, that can be quite infuriating. But, yeah. yeah.
Jamie, what, in terms of building consent documents and full construction documents, what would you say major differences in that of level of detail and information? I know it's probably a very broad question, but...
Well, I mean, I'm thankful that the council are putting the consultants through the loops in terms of consent processing, because it does now mean that we are, you know, getting a good set of documents, because you can't fudge it. It's got to be correct to get it through the council. Say there's no promissory notes. It's got to be on the documents, or you can't get it consented.
It's probably a question for Sarah maybe, but like the NZIA, I understand that they've got a standard that they adhere to that says a set of building consent documents is only a design intent. Are you aware of that?
The challenge we face is from a risk perspective is that we can't say it's for construction until it's got a consent.
Can't form a stand for
But it can't form a stand for construction. So
but is the level of information that goes into building consent to a full construction?
That's the expectation, and certainly I think I agree with Jamie, that's always the intent. It's, where that falls over is if there are sort of changes late in the design process, then we will pick up the things that are not consentable and just focus on the absolute critical path items to keep the program moving. But yeah, the initial consent is always a detailed design as a focus can capture as much as possible in terms of consenting for construction for tender to make sure it's comprehensive.
Yeah. So more the better.
Yeah, for sure.
Because the key thing I said in terms of, you know, getting input from the specialists out there. So, you know, RFA, you know, the roofing, you know, Metalcraft was specified. So up front, we said to Metalcraft, this is where the building is, this is the wind report and all the rest of it, and we're near to the sea. As a supplier of that product, are you happy with it? And can you confirm to us the metal, you know, the fixings for that metal roofing, so that we actually got a PS1 out of them to go into the consent documents? You know, how many roofs that are probably in Auckland that haven't been properly engineered? You know, from a wind point of view, could be a major. But
can I go back to Martin's comment earlier? So about cost management, and so I've been pretty keen on your comments. So one of the reasons that I think you've been successful as a design manager is because you're also a cost manager. And the projects that I've been on where the design management has happened really well, the design manager and sort of cost manager are sort of just about not quite the same person often, but got a tight team going. So managing to a cost plan is just as important as coordinating and managing the design. So any comments on all of that, Jamie?
Yeah, I guess I have got the advantages because I am a quantity surveyor from early training, are heavily involved in doing cost plans and putting together a lot of our tenders, so, dollar construction, so I can easily look at something and see whether that is affordable or not. But I would say if I had a design manager and you've got a PQS as part of your team, then you should be able to get the PQS to be, to assist you in that regard. Unfortunately, again, the PQSs, whether it becomes clients aren't signing them up for the right basis and all that, but it's key that a PQS is involved at preliminary design stage, that he's got to update his cost plan at the developed design stage, he's got to review the documents at the end of detailed design phase before it goes out to tender or whatever, and is that set of documents the same as he priced off? All too often I get where the jobs come over the budget and the QS said, I didn't know that was in there, and you're saying, well, hold on, why didn't during the tender period you bloody review the drawings to check, because you know what the job inside out, why didn't you pick it up? But it might be that they were never engaged to do that. But I agree with Martin, having a good QS on board to assist with the budgets on the way through or cost options or whatever is key. Yeah. Lucky I've got that experience and we'll do that for our jobs, but but you can still be a design manager and just call upon someone that will do that for you. As
I think, Jamie, some of the problem though is a lot of PQSs aren't cost planners, and it's quite a different, as you well know, quite a different skill set, and the ability to look at a design, from that preliminary cost plan. We should be able to produce a cost plan and preliminary design that's robust enough to take us through a design process, and we see time and time again that doesn't occur.
And I say to our design, thing through there, that cost plan document should be a well-thumbed document because you should be referring it all the way through, what have I got for building services, for mechanical, have I got that covered or whatever like that. So going through.
One of the other challenges, Jamie, at the moment is continuity of staff. There's a lot of movement in the industry. So have you got any tips for putting some steps in place should critical team members or consultants depart the project prior to?
Well, that's a very good point. Usually for the principal consultants that's not an issue, but I have found building services that Aria Bay is not a good example, but we probably had the electrical was, by the time we finished it was the fourth guy involved, and you're having, it's frustrating because you're always having to regurgitate, them to be up to it.
Yeah. Any tips or tricks or plans you can put in place to help them?
I guess one of the key ones is that the principle of that particular practice needs to be involved. Whether if someone goes, then he's always there to carry that continuity across, and you're not
Your level of documentation though would ensure that if you lose someone, it's not a big step backwards. At the very least, it's marking time until the new guy can pick it up. Whereas if you're not relying on something as formal as that, the minute someone leaves, all the knowledge they've got with them is gone.
Yeah. I guess at the again, at the consultant engagement is one of the checks is what are the consultants' resources, and what other jobs they've currently got on at the same time as your design program. So if they say they can deliver your design and they've got 10 other projects and the one person doing all 10, then you've probably got alarm bells then that company's probably not going to be able to service you diligently.
Jamie, probably the last one for, so as a design manager and everybody's moving more towards BIM integration and designing that live environment, what level of standard do you get involved in with that level of coordination in that BIM environment? Do you actually have your own BIM license, log in, check, spin, coordinate, or do you just ask for a clash detection report, or where do you draw that line between where you actually start owning the design and just checking the quality of coordination?
Well, BIM is certainly something growing. I guess it is something I'm finding to use it properly is getting a bit beyond my skills, but I've got Jennifer who's very good at that, and And we won that on the Aria Bay, for instance. On stage 1, I guess the services were done, traditional, and the shop drawings were done in a traditional sense. But on stage 2, we as a concept, and we had a few issues which were fine-tuned for the next one, is where we brought on a BIM consultant to do the services shop drawings. And we've found that in the construction phase that has resulted in a lot less, RFIs. There's been a lot more clarity for the site team as a result of that. So that did prove its benefit. It wasn't cheap, so there's probably some mindset of dollars that we've got to get over there. But
the company Asbuilt were you using there? Asbuilt, Asbuilt, Asbuilt.
No. Build BIM we used on that one, but there are a number of them out there, Construction Workshop and Asbuilt, but no, we had ground. So I do see the benefit if you can bring, get the services involved doing shop drawings on the BIM, and ideally is bringing them, if we can, into the start of detailed design. Then you can get some real winners there. So if sometimes.
So Jamie, another question. So with design, so what we're learning here is you can't learn design management in a 3-hour session here. You can touch on a whole bunch of stuff, and you can poke a bit or stick it in. It's a bit like your iceberg. How do we train up our design managers, or how do you go about training the next Jamie Vallance in your organisation? Because I think that's.
We've got Jennifer here has been several years with us, and Andrea has just started with us. But
she's on how we train the next Jamie Vallance.
Mine has all come from learnings, experience. So I guess you get that from a contract. If you've been burnt once, you're not going to be burnt on it next time. But you might find something new, and you're always plugging up the old dike sort of thing like that. But I'll never get caught twice. I might get caught once, but never twice. And that's the experience I build. So any project I come to and I've learnt something on other projects, I always bring that forward to the design process and questions. And those design deliverables, bullet points get longer each time, because I think, God, he got me there, and better tuck this one in. Well, not tuck it in. It's just clarifying that there's no ambiguity later on.
So if you've got to learn on the job, and the next Jamie Vallance, he doesn't. We don't want him to have all the mistakes that you made. So how do you do that? Have you got to get this design manager apprentice person? Are they going to be starting on $1 million job and then moving to a bigger job, or how do you see the process out there?
Well, the one that the experienced one is that you can't do it from sitting in your office and someone sitting in their office. I will always go to that person's office and sit down with them and work through it with them. I find that solves a lot of issue, and I encourage all our design managers and all that to get go out, actually confront the situation. Don't hide behind a desk or a screen. Actually go and sort it out. And if you're listening in good design meetings or particular coordination meetings, you can learn an awful lot in that process and get an understanding of the issues, so that when you come to review a set of documents later, I remember if at that design meeting or that coordination there's an issue here, has that been resolved? So it's just simple checks like that. And some of it, is just checking. Does a downpipe match up with the civil engineer's, drainage drawing? I mean, it still doesn't happen that. But I mean, that's an easy check if you've got the time put down to look a week ahead. Sit down, of marking up a set of drawings, and But you got to roll your sleeves up. It's design management isn't by getting others to do your work. You've actually got to do it yourself, and roll your sleeves up, mark up the set of drawings, and raise the questions where things are short.
So for a true design management function, how much time do you expect, or would you want a person to spend on it through the design process?
150%.
So one person.
A design manager can't be someone that's doing 10%. It's just.
So one person, 100% full time throughout the design phases.
Per project.
Can you come and talk to my boss?
Well, you can answer that. Can you do your due job in 50% of your time as against 100%?
So, Jamie, from what you were just saying before, though, and Graham's question, you know, design management has become a role. It's something, you know, and we go back to the Mainzeal days where, you know, you started doing it and that team got bigger and bigger. So it's the same sort of thing. So I think, Graham, the answer is we need to be saying, you know, we have cadet QSs and we have cadet project managers or cadet construction managers. We know, you know, and junior architects and junior engineers. You know, if we want to take design management seriously as an industry, that's the same sort of role. We need to be telling the employers that they need to be investing, because at the end of the day, they're the ones that are going to get the benefit. And you've got people like Jamie that, you know, have got all this knowledge and he's just going to slide away to his batch and we'll never get to see it again.
Yeah. I mean, you got to remember, when I first came in the industry, the architect was he was the lead. He employed all the consultants. He was lead. He was literally God to the project, and he most often that were adjudicated on, you know, extensions and times and all that. So he can never be wrong with his documents because he was adjudicating and all the rest of it. But yeah, but the set of documents then, because I did a lot of measuring in my young times there, you know, on big hospital projects, Gisborne Hospital and North Shore Hospital and all the rest of it, where the documents were just absolutely, you know, fabulous. You know, every elevation of a room would be elevated, everything was marked out and all the rest of it. But they were, to be fair, given a lot longer period. So they might be designing it for 4 years before it even came out to tender.
And paid a lot more, a much bigger fee.
Yeah.
See, that's a good question. My mate Marshy wants to know who's going to pay for this design manager.
Well, you tell me, most jobs that go pear-shaped, how much that's actually cost the client?
So I guess you've been successful in convincing clients to pay the fee. But if there's not one, you just get on and do it anyway?
Well, I mean, they will more or less, if you've got to, you know, do it properly, thing will save you that cost in, you know, time delays, extension of time, variations and all the rest of it that, you know, you've all been there, you know, in terms of build contracts that have gone sour because of design documents being poor. The cost of that to the poor client at the end of the day is a lot more than having a design manager.
Have you experienced where you've got a client where the client is engaging a design manager that's employed by NZ Strong, and then as part of the construction process where you've got EOTs, or not EOTs, but variations resulting from poor design, then the client turns around and goes, whoa, I've paid you for design manager to coordinate and manage this design, so I don't want to hear about your variation as a result of a poor design. Have you experienced similar situations to that, or not?
But I guess we're just saying, if it was a build-only design in a traditional sense, all we're suggesting is that the client employs someone as a design manager, and that might be, you know, like Ignite. It may be employing Ignite, but they have Shara as their full-time design manager. So it's not necessarily the lead consultant or, you know, the designer architecturally, but she can manage the design process. Yeah. It doesn't necessarily have to be a builder's design manager to be a design manager. You can be a design manager that can look after the consultants without the construction phase.
Should we keep Jamie here all night, or does anyone want to go home? I could listen to it all night, but maybe people have got somewhere to go.
Graham, as long as you provide the feedback.
Any last burning question that you've just got to get out? Otherwise, I think we'll try and wrap things up, Jamie. No burning questions? Next time, Dan will dive into a bunch more detail about the design management process and also Jennifer from a tendering point of view. But round of applause for Jamie.